Jane Fonda, and I am thrilled to be part of this conversation with two women that I admire. This is part of a series of discussions hosted by the Little Market in celebration of Women's History Month. Now, for those of you who don't know the Little Market, they are a nonprofit fair trade shop that features beautifully made and ethically sourced products. They create dignified work for artisans, celebrating their cultural traditions and supporting them in work in safe and healthy spaces for a living wage. Just recently, the Little Market celebrated an important milestone. In less than a decade, it has created 1 million hours of dignified work for artisans in over 25 countries in some of the most underserved and marginalized areas of the world. And I'm so pleased to be talking to two amazing women and their activists about their work and their communities. My friend Mónica Ramírez founded Justice for Migrant Women, and she is the co-founder of the Latinx House, She Se Puede, and Alianza Nacional de Campesina. She's working to make change through these and many other organizations. She calls herself a serious social entrepreneur. She and I have lobbied together in DC for overtime pay for farm workers. And then Allie Young created Protect the Sacred, and we'll talk more about why she did that during the conversation. She's an activist on the human rights of Indigenous people, especially in the Navajo or Diné Nation. Welcome to you both. So glad to be talking to you both. Let's start off by discussing the impact of COVID. Both of you come from communities that have been deeply and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Allie, you grew up in Kirtland, New Mexico, one of the hardest hit regions in the US. Tell us why you decided to go home in the middle of the pandemic and what's happening there.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And I'm so glad to be speaking with you, Jane. Yeah, I decided to come home in the middle of a pandemic, because I was living alone, honestly, the last 5 years in Los Angeles. And I don't get to see my family very often over here, in my hometown, in the Navajo Nation. And I took it as an opportunity to spend some time with my family. But when I got here, the cases started to rise in Navajo Nation. And that's when, maybe I came home for a reason, but I'm glad I did, because when my health physicians, my friends who are physicians and public health professionals at the Indian Health Service in Shiprock, New Mexico, reached out to me, and they said, "We need your help. We need you to communicate with the young people." And then I started Protect the Sacred. But I've been helping my people ever since, and I just felt a calling, and I couldn't stand by to see my people suffer through this pandemic. So I did all I could to bring resources and funding here.
Oh God, I'm so grateful to you. My heart is just broken when I read how badly your people have been affected by COVID, especially in Gallup, I read. And I've traveled a lot through your country. All through Chaco Canyon and, Mesa, the big mesas, and on horseback, and spent the night. And it's the most beautiful country in the whole world. We need to protect the people and the land that's there. And thank you for staying. Are you there now?
I'm still here, yes. And the stories of this land as well, which come from our elders. And that's the reason that I'm fighting so hard still, because we're still in this pandemic.
Right, and the elders have the language, right? They are the holders of the ceremonies and the language and the prayers, and that's why it's just so tragic when we lose them. Has it gotten any better?
Yeah, it's getting better, especially with the vaccine rollout, which is going great here, and I know I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the cases are coming down. The death toll is kind of the curves flattening, which was scary. You know, we're a population here of 170-ish thousand people that still live in Navajo Nation, and the death toll is over 1,000 people. So, you know, we're feeling that, and still very much mourning the loss of our relatives. But we're strong, and we're going to get through it.
Yeah. Why do you think that Indigenous communities are so vulnerable, both, to both the health consequences and the economic consequences of COVID? I mean, I know the answer, but I want you to say.
Yeah, well, you know, we have a relationship with the federal government, and we have our treaty rights, and part of some of our treaties is access to healthcare and education. But through this pandemic, we're seeing that hasn't been so much the case. You know, we're lacking as far as resources and funding when it comes to especially healthcare in tribal nations. And that's something, you know, going forward, I hope we can pay attention to, work with the new administration on. And then also something that I've been pointing out to folks is, you know, the connection to Mother Earth, and how our lands, especially in reservations, have been completely, you know, destroyed by the extractive industries. And to me, I'm a person who's like, let's look at the root of the problem. And the root in my nation, especially, we've seen, you know, we've gone through decades of coal mining and uranium mining. And if you look at the maps of where my people, the hot spots within the Navajo Nation, they're in those areas where uranium mining and coal mining existed. And, you know, what does that do? Our people have become so dependent on those jobs, yeah, and have been working in these very unsafe environments. Our elders, you know, our bodies have been contaminated by uranium and coal in our lands as well. So that has left a lot of our people in a very vulnerable situation, where in terms of their health and respiratory diseases and cancers. And then on top of that, those areas the waters have dried up there. So people are learning that 30% of our people don't have access to running water, 40% of our people don't have access to electricity. Well, you know, we have to look at why. And so I'm trying to connect those dots for people.
Great. You know, if there was no racism, there would be no climate crisis. The fossil fuel industry historically has used low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous lands, as they call them, sacrifice zones. You know, that's where they do their dirty work. And also the presence of man camps, right? You're seeing, I'm sure, a lot of disappearance of women and sexual assaults on indigenous women around the man camps?
Oh, absolutely. That's something that we're continuing to, you know, to fight for our people and justice for our missing and murdered indigenous women.
Yeah, do you want to explain what man camp?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's, to me, it's like, it's a no-brainer, you know. Of course, these man camps are set up around these construction sites. So a lot of non-Native men are coming to these areas to work. And then they go into the reservations, into the communities, and, you know, whether, you know, they're just meeting them, you know, somewhere in the community or at a bar even. And they're taking advantage of our women, and all of a sudden our women are going missing. And it wasn't until, I think, 2008 that Native women, the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized to include Indigenous women, because before that, non-Native men could come into our lands and be protected by, jurisdiction. So they can come in and rape our women and what have you, and then go outside of the reservation and they're protected. But now we can, Native women can press charges on non-Native men, even if they're not on our tribal lands.
I'm very happy to hear that. And now I'm going to turn to you, Mónica, and I have to tell the audience, the first time that I knew Monica's name was several years ago at the very beginning of the Me Too movement, which became, for actors in the entertainment industry, the Time's Up movement. A letter arrived sent by Mónica Ramírez, representing the Alliance of Women Farm Workers, standing in sisterhood with the women of Hollywood. We understand what you are facing, sisters, and we stand in solidarity with you. And it had a huge impact on many of us. It meant the world, and I'm just always so grateful to Mónica for thinking of doing that. And so, Mónica, Latinx, the Latinx community in general has been disproportionately affected by COVID. Help us understand why.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here in conversation with you, Jane and Allie. So inspired by all the work that you're doing, and I'm so. I think it's been a really important journey that we've been on since the Time's Up movement started. So I'm also grateful for that experience of us building, this new movement together. And so now here we are with COVID, and it has gravely impacted the Latinx community, as is the case for so many other communities. One of the things that we've seen for our community is that we have huge rates of infection. Many people in our community are dying. Many people in our community did not have access to testing, did not have access to the preventative measures that were needed. And when we talk about the essential workers or frontline workers who were asked to continue keeping our country going throughout this pandemic, the Latinx community is overrepresented in those frontline workers. And so day after day, Latinx community members were showing up as farm workers, as restaurant workers, as domestic workers, grocery store workers, and so many other of these essential fields, and they weren't being given the protective gear that they needed. They weren't being given access to all of the materials that they would have needed. People talk to us about having no information about what they were supposed to do to even protect themselves. And certainly people weren't giving much thought to the social distancing requirements and other things. And so we quickly saw high rates of infection in community members across the country. And sadly, we continue to see the rates of deaths skyrocketing. And it's in urban communities, and it is also in rural communities like the community where I live.
Where do you live?
I live in rural Ohio. I live in an agricultural community because my family, comes from the farm worker background. And so much of the work that we've been doing during the COVID crisis has been focused on the farm worker community. And I think that what people don't understand about this COVID crisis is that some of the suffering that people have experienced is not only related to getting sick with COVID, it's all the other kinds of fallout that have occurred because of the pandemic. And so in the farm worker community, we understood very quickly that farm workers were at huge risk, but we also learned that the very same farm workers who work all day to feed us were going home without food for themselves and for their families because the store shelves were empty, or because they didn't have enough money to buy food, or they couldn't make it to the food pantry in time before the pantry closed down. And so, we've just seen all the harm that's created by this pandemic and the failures of many systems that have all kind of come to a head during this past year as we've all lived through this pandemic.
Right. I'm going to just say two things. What I said before to Allie is also true here. I think we all have to understand that low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous lands, because they have been considered sacrifice zones, that's where toxic dumps are. It's where oil wells and fracking pits are, and refineries and petrochemical companies, right where people live, go to school, playgrounds. And so the populations of the people who live in these sacrifice zones because of the fossil fuel industry have extremely high rates of lung disease, of asthma, of cancer, of heart diseases. It's really unforgivable. So they're already compromised, and then along comes COVID, right?
That's right. And, so the underlying conditions that health conditions that people had have caused some of the higher rates of death that we've seen from COVID. But, the other thing that has been the case is that many of the community members that we're talking about didn't have the basic rights that were needed or the safety nets in place to be able to sustain through a pandemic like this one. So we can't forget about the fact that when you aren't paying workers fairly, or when you're not providing workers with leave, or giving them all the benefits that they need, they can't make it on a day-to-day basis. They weren't making it before the pandemic, and certainly now during this pandemic, things have not gotten any easier, and in fact, they've gotten much worse.
Yeah. Well, as a glass half full gal, I want to know if you agree with this. See, what I think is that the pandemic has opened a lot of people's eyes to the realities of what maybe even the majority of Americans' lives are like. Everybody applauds the essential workers and bangs the pans, and they understand that, as you said, these people go home and they can't put food on their own table. They have to work multiple jobs. They can't afford to go home even if they're sick, and they get paid so little. That's why the $15 minimum wage is so important. I think people's eyes are being opened really for the first time about the extent of the inequality in this country, and they're prepared to fight to do something about it. Do you feel that?
I do feel that. We did some polling in September, right around Labor Day, and the overwhelming response that we received from the poll was that everyday people are in favor of more rights and benefits for these workers. They understand what they sacrifice. They think that the government should be stepping up for these workers. And we did a town hall with farm workers right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was probably a month or so into the pandemic, and one of the most powerful things that I heard from one of the farm worker community members who took part in it, they said, people finally see us. And when you're from a community like ours that has been invisible for so long, being seen really, really matters. So I couldn't agree more with you, Jane. I think that is right.
Allie, you were vaccinated in February. That must have felt like a very consequential moment for you. Tell us how the vaccine rollout is going in Navajo Nation.
The vaccine rollout in the Navajo Nation is going really well. And when I got vaccinated, so I'm just finishing up the 2-week period where I've reached the peak of immunity. So I'm feeling great. I was very fortunate to get it. I didn't feel anything. I know that some folks are feeling, exhausted and tired after their second dose, but I didn't feel that. I'm fortunate that my whole family has been vaccinated at this point. And so it's going really well here. The age requirement has dropped down to 16 years and over in Navajo Nation. And I've was so honored to join my friends at IHS and the whole, frontline crew to, I participated in the vaccination event last Saturday. So I was a volunteer there, and, just seeing the people coming through and how they've set it up, it's very seamless at this point. So it's going very well. And Navajo Nation has 110 communities within our tribal government, and the vaccination sites are in every region of Navajo Nation. And our president, Jonathan Nez, has been doing such a great job at working with both Indian Health Service and also tribally run health facilities. So there's great communication going on there, where that didn't really exist before the pandemic. And now they're seeing how important it is to communicate and work and collaborate together. And it's amazing. And I think that I truly feel that, because I know it's not only successful in Navajo Nation, it's successful in a lot of other tribal communities across Indian country. And I think the reason for that is we've been given the tools and the resources to roll it out among our tribal members. And to me, that is, that's sovereignty. And I feel that if we had been given the same opportunity when the pandemic first hit, where, you know, we weren't even included in the CARES Act funding, and Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids had to fight for our inclusion. And then once that process started going, the funding was, the allocation of it was delayed by another month. And so we didn't receive funding here in Navajo Nation until probably the beginning of the summer. And so that really set us back. And had we gotten those resources and that funding a lot earlier, I think we could have prevented those spikes that we were seeing in the nation.
Hey, do we have to enthuse and applaud the fact that Deb Haaland looks like she's going to be confirmed? Is this historic or what for the Secretary of the Interior?
Absolutely. We're very excited. We're working hard to push senators to vote yes. And yeah, I'm excited for her. She's the right person for sure.
Yeah, what a difference this is going to make. How amazing that an Indigenous woman is in charge of all of these beautiful lands that for millennia, Indigenous people have risked their lives to try to save. What were you going to say?
I think that's the way it should be. And I don't know why it's taken this long for a Native person to hold that position. It makes sense to me. It's the Department of the Interior does not only oversees, the lands and our national parks, but also the the Bureau of Indian Affairs falls under the Department of the Interior. So it makes sense to me that a Native person with our knowledge of how to protect Mother Earth should hold that position, but also we should be overseeing ourselves. And that's why I think there's been such a disconnect between that relationship between tribal nations and the federal government. And now with Deb there, I know that she fights fiercely for Indigenous peoples, but she fights fiercely for Mother Earth. And that's going to be exciting.
So exciting. Mónica, what changes are you hoping to see from the new administration that will lift up migrant workers?
Well, we actually have sent over a document to the administration listing out some of the things that we urgently need them to do. I mean, most people don't realize that for agriculture and for many of the industries that Latinx community members are working in, there are no mandates in place that would require employers to take measures to keep people healthy and safe during this COVID crisis. So one of the first things that we're asking the administration to do is to implement a health and safety mandate for all workplaces and for all workers. That's critical. The other thing that we are asking is to ensure that the federal government allocates sufficient funds for domestic violence and sexual violence shelters and programs, and that they have funding that is for culturally appropriate and linguistically appropriate services. That is critical because we have seen a spike in violence throughout this pandemic, and unfortunately, the resources that are needed to do the outreach have not been met by Congress. And so we are asking the administration to please take that very seriously. Certainly, we need changes to immigration into our immigration system and have asked for lots of rollbacks to some of the things that the Trump administration did that made it more difficult for immigrants, like releasing families from immigrant detention and making the U visa and the T visa, which are special visas for people who are victims of certain crimes. We've asked them to please make those visas more available to people to lift the caps and to make it, more accessible for people to actually apply. So, we have a whole range of things. And one of the other things that we've been asking for is the way that data is being collected by the federal government and has been historically collected by the federal government actually is flawed, because it makes it difficult for us to see how different people are experiencing different problems, because the data is not being disaggregated. So we have asked the administration, when doing data collection, that they disaggregate the data so that we can see how men and women are experiencing certain problems. And in particular, with the agricultural survey that is done, the agricultural worker survey that's done, we've asked that they please disaggregate the data by gender so that we can really understand what farm worker women are experiencing as compared to their male counterparts. And the list goes on. I mean, there are some things that we are still fighting to address that people don't even realize are problems in this country. That people don't realize that kids are working in agriculture legally without restriction as of the age of 12. And so we're asking that the administration please take action so that our children don't continue to go to work in the fields without restrictions, and where they're being exposed to harmful pesticides and dangerous equipment. We need those changes urgently. So, those are among the priorities, but I think we have something like a 20-page document that we've sent over with the priorities that we have.
And as the climate grows warmer, I think of farm workers bent over all day and the sun beating down and heat that's over 100 degrees. It just breaks my heart. And so many migrants that have come to the border are women from Honduras and Guatemala who can't anymore farm because of the prolonged drought and the heat. They're climate refugees, and I'm glad we have a president who's got a big heart and is more empathic to their plight. So let's move on to talking about lifting the voices of historically marginalized communities. Both of you work to bring the voices of your communities to the center of conversations that affect their rights, so that they can decide what they want their futures to look like. There's an important mantra that everybody should remember: nothing about us without us, right? For marginalized communities, for too long, a bunch of white men have decided what's right and what's going to help marginalized communities. Nothing about us without us, right?
I'm happy to jump in. So that, nothing about us without us, that is the mantra that we also use with the Latinx House, which is one of the organizations that I co-founded. And we couldn't agree more. When it comes to the story about Latinx people in our country, the story that has been told about us is wrong. And the reason that people are getting the story about our community wrong is because we have not been permitted to tell our own stories. We've not been permitted to write our own stories. We've been misrepresented in entertainment by the media. Publishing houses aren't publishing our work. So there are a lot of people to be held accountable to make sure that we are having our stories told appropriately. But that extends to members of Congress as well, which is why it's exciting to see political leaders from different backgrounds now running for office and winning at all levels of government, because the data shows that when communities are represented by people who look like them and understand their experiences, then the policy that is favorable to them and their priorities and experiences also follows. And so we feel strongly that we need more women in office. We need more Latinx community members in office in all marginalized communities, so that we can actually be at the table to make the decisions that are good for our lives.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Allie?
Yes, I agree with everything that Mónica has said. And the same goes for Indigenous communities. I often say that we are the most underrepresented community in film, TV, and media. And, we've been invisible. We still are in some ways. And that's something that we're fighting against. Invisibility, and we have to tell our own stories, because we've been for far too long misrepresented. And I always say that the negative stereotypes that exist of Native peoples in this country was birthed in cinema, and we need to correct that. And the only way to correct that is if we're in control and telling our own stories. And even through this pandemic, you know, there's been moments where media has, you know, kind of gone with the poverty porn angle when covering Indigenous communities. But, you know, that's why it's important for us to speak out. And nowadays it's easier to do that because of social media. And you can go onto social media and see many Native activists sharing, you know, our fight from our perspective and our voice. And it's very important. And we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep fighting. And, you know, go to #Native Twitter on Twitter, and you'll find all of the best scholars and activists and advocates for Indian country there.
You know, during the 4 months that I was in DC holding rallies that we called Fire Drill Fridays, and we had so many Indigenous women come and speak. And, you know, I've traveled to a lot of tribal lands and I thought I knew a lot. It just blew my mind to realize the extent to which it's Indigenous people, mostly women, but also men, North America, Canada, who have put their bodies on the line to stop the destruction of boreal forests and Indigenous lands, literally risking their lives. And they've succeeded. They've succeeded. And it's, you know, it's not just the famous ones, the Standing Rocks and the Keystone XL, but, you know, little pipelines, not so little, but little struggles in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and other places where it's Indigenous women who have stopped terrible pipelines from crossing the Appalachian Trail, for example. And I'm so committed to trying to get people, helping people understand the extent to which Indigenous people are on the front lines of saving planet Earth, not just for themselves, but for all of us. Another question for you both. The summer protests in the US drew attention, this is after the murder of George Floyd, drew attention to structural racism in really unprecedented ways. And how did that influence your work? I'll start with you, Mónica.
Sure, thank you. One of the questions that that we asked ourselves out of the gate was, how are we in the farm worker movement really showing up to support our Black allies, you know, and friends from the African American community? We asked ourselves, like, how are we as a movement ensuring that we are not contributing to anti-Black racism? And we talked a lot about the fact that even within the farm worker community, the majority of which is Mexican, you know, the majority of farm workers in our country are Mexican, but there are Haitian farm workers and there are Black farm workers. There have been Black farm workers in the South for hundreds of years, right? And so we engage in conversations about how we're showing up as a movement and how we are lending our support, our platforms, our voices. And you know, we made a commitment that we have to continue to interrogate ourselves and our practices, and that we can't have a situation in which we and our movements are only asking people to support our campaigns and our work when we need to elevate them, but we have to continually make the commitment to also be extending our support and our resources and whatever we have that can be useful. And one of the big things that we engaged around was calling on the Spanish language media that has a lot of anti-Black portrayals in the stories that are being told and the novellas that are being shown. And so we engaged in some work around a petition to call on Spanish language media to do better, because they were not helping in the way that they were covering the protests or George Floyd's murder. And so we said, you know, we need to figure out how we're using our connections in those spaces in order to try to address those problems and put an end to them.
Yeah, the protests over the summer certainly influenced my work and the ways we collaborate as well. And just to echo what Mónica said, you know, communities of color have to be there for each other, and that's how we overcome this structural racism, and we show up for one another. And throughout the protests, that's something, we were being hit hard at that time, but we were also sure to show up for our Black relatives and in their fight through the summer and ongoing. And I think it's revealed to us that we have to do this together, and we have to collaborate. We have to uplift one another. And going forward, I'm committed to that work. And even in my own community in Navajo Nation, there's been a lot of mutual aid efforts that have popped up throughout the nation. And that's what has saved our people during this pandemic, is working together.
I think it's what frightens the oligarchs in this country more than anything, the coming together of the forces, the movements that they try to keep separated, Black, brown, indigenous, white, coming together. That's called power. That means power. Mónica, you started the Latinx House in the beginning of 2020. Tell us what it does and how it's going.
Sure. So the Latinx House is a project that was created by myself, Olga Segura, and Alex Martinez Kondrecki. Alex and Olga are both filmmakers. And the reason that the idea came to the forefront was because there was an awareness that there were not very many Latinx films that were being accepted into Sundance Film Festival. And Sundance Film Festival is considered to be sort of a gateway to the big screen and to really making it as an artist. And so Alex and Olga came to me and they asked me if I'd help build this house. And I said, sure, I'll help build the house so that we can try to apply pressure so that Sundance will accept more Latinx films and celebrate more Latinx artists. But I'll only do it if the Latinx House can exist beyond Sundance Film Festival, because Sundance Film Festival is not very accessible to our community overall. And so when we created the Latinx House, it was with the idea of creating a place and a space for people who care about the Latinx community, want to uplift the Latinx community, and who want to learn about the Latinx community. And so we launched at Sundance, and then we went into the virtual world like everyone else because of the COVID pandemic. But the intention is to set the house up at places of consequence. So, at places like South by Southwest and in other spaces, so that we can engage folks in these conversations. And we want to bring together, filmmakers and creators, but we want to make sure that there are community organizers and leaders from our community who are also brought into these spaces, because we're trying to overcome the fact that there are certain places where only certain people are invited in to be part of events and conversations, and we need to bring people together across all economic strata. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do through our work.
Well, that's beautiful. Give us some examples of social justice stories that the Latinx House is committed to telling.
Well, because I come from a workers' rights background, we have been committed to telling workers' rights stories. And one of the panels that we did at Sundance last year was focused on the role that movies can play in bringing about economic justice. And so we included a domestic worker from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But I know we're friends with all the folks at National Domestic Workers Alliance, and we invited a representative from Participant Media that made the film Roma, and a couple of other filmmakers to talk about how we could actually see some advancements there. And so in addition to that, we've done some work around the rights of farm workers and have tried to highlight other workers, other industries where changes need to be made and could be made through film. But in addition to that, one of the things the Latinx House did very early on when we were starting to launch the project was we helped organize the Querida Familia letter, which was the letter that was signed by Latinx leaders across the country in response to the El Paso massacre. And that's very important because people don't understand that when stories are told about us in our communities, that are false, it isn't just a bad or an ugly thing. There are actual real consequences. People's lives are on their line. The livelihoods of individuals are on the line when people are being misrepresented, because then it causes people to have bias towards them and to feel as though they can enact hate and harm upon them. So we've taken that on as well as an organization. And the other thing that we've taken on is really the mission of rebranding the Latinx community and the way the country and the world thinks about the Latinx community. Our community is often thought of as takers. We are not thought of people who are giving or contributing to this country in the way that we should. So we've been focusing on uplifting all the positive contributions of our community across industries and sectors. And we've done that through art and through film, through novels, by highlighting the different individuals who are making strides in those areas, because we want this country and the world to understand that we do have something to give, and we are giving of ourselves every single day in an attempt to make this country and world better.
Allie, you've been raising awareness about the very specific and deeply dangerous way that COVID is threatening Indigenous culture. Tell us about Protect the Sacred.
Protect the Sacred is a grassroots initiative that I launched at the end of March last year in 2020. It's a project that's housed at Harness, which is where my full-time job is. And yeah, when I started it, it started with a Facebook Live, honestly. And I'm friends with Mark Ruffalo and Julia Walsh. And when I came home and started helping out with the health physicians who called on me and said, can you help us connect with the young people? We need to get these messages to the young people. And so we started creating messaging together, and then they would push out that messaging to myself and to other young Dina people to put on our own social media, make a meme or get creative with it. And the reason for that is because Indian Health Service is a federally run program. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the public health campaigns through IHS have to be cleared and this whole process, and there just wasn't time for that. So we, they kind of slipped it to us under the table, and then we pushed it out on our own social medias channels. And so I started making memes. One was in honor of our public health crusader, Annie Dodge Wanika. And I'm deeply inspired by her work. And she is our public health shiro. And she has this quote that says, I will go and do more. And so she sacrificed, her whole life to fight for Dina people and for our safety and our health. And so I made this meme that said, I will go and do more. And I came up with this whole caption calling out to our young people that they can be heroes and sheroes in this time as well. And all they have to do is stay home and communicate the very important messaging from the CDC to their grandparents and to their relatives who may not understand what they're watching on television, and to translate that for them. And I said, hashtag be like Annie, hashtag protect the sacred, because in doing these things, we are protecting the sacred. We are protecting our elders who hold that sacred knowledge and the knowledge and the ceremonial ways and the languages that we're still learning from them. And that comes from me personally as well, because my grandfather is a medicine man. And going through, the pandemic, my family was very, we were terrified that something might happen to him and my grandmother. And I have my paternal grandfather and my maternal grandfather, both of them were medicine men. My paternal grandfather passed away about 5 years ago. And so all we have in my family is my maternal grandfather. And so I was like, we got to do something. We got to fight. We got to connect to the young people and tell them, this is real. Our culture is at stake here in our languages. And so that's how we launched. Julia called me up and she was like, what's going on in Navajo Nation? I'm hearing that the cases are spiking. And I said, yeah, I'm working with these physicians. And she said, well, we should do a larger campaign. She's like, I like that thing, protect the sacred, but let's develop it around that. And she said, you should email Mark and see if we can do like a Facebook Live or something. And so I emailed Mark late one night, and the next morning he was like, yes, just tell me when to show up, where to show up. And so of course it was virtual, and we launched a Facebook Live with some Diné youth, Mark and some Diné comedians. And we just all talked about what's happening and why it's important to stay home, wash your hands, etc. And then from there, we did another one called Calling All Heroes. And Mark invited Paul Rudd onto that one, and Taika Waititi, and President Nez of the Navajo Nation also joined. So we just kept having these conversations and kept focusing on other parts of what was happening currently that was affecting Indigenous peoples, like the census and voting as well.
The pandemic has shone a light on the importance of investing in Indigenous culture and traditions. And what would you like to see that would help protect and uplift this important part of our society?
I would like to see the new administration, the Biden-Harris administration, pay attention to what we're fighting for and to invest in it as well. Indigenous knowledge and that ancestral knowledge is important, and not only to Native peoples, but to the rest of the world when you think about the knowledge we hold in relation to Mother Earth, and thinking about the other big fight that we're up against, which is climate change. And I would like to see investment in revitalizing language, culture, and preserving it as well. And I think that there was a lot of work that had been done, I think the last 15 years, around cultural and language revitalization that is gonna be set back because of this pandemic. And so we need resources and funding to continue that work.
I've seen firsthand why it's so important to empower young people by connecting them to their culture. I went to Alcatraz when it was being occupied in 1970, 69, 70. Indigenous people from the Bay Area, young people mostly, occupied the island of Alcatraz that had been a federal prison. And in time, there were elders there, Thomas Banyaka from the Hopi tribe, who I knew, and others. And Wilma Mankiller was a very young woman at the time, and she was there. And a lot of them, like Wilma, had never met their elders, the medicine men. And it had a huge impact. And at that time, there was a division between the American Indian movement, AIM, Russell Means and Dennis Banks and others, and those who felt it was important to lift up and return to the original culture and ceremonies. Big dialogues would go on. But when I was in Standing Rock in the fall of 2016, I could see they're back. The prayers, the ceremonies, the sweat lodges, and what a great thing it was to see that, and how many people have been saved from alcohol and drugs because of that. I just want to tell you right now, Allie, that if there's anything I can do to help you, please call on me, okay?
Okay.
It's very much a part of my activist life, is what goes on with Indigenous people on tribal lands. It means a lot to me for all kinds of reasons. So we're going to move on to violence against women. Mónica, you've advocated for the right of women farm workers, migrants, and other low-income women to be free from violence in the workplace. And you've been an influential voice in the Me Too movement, as I said in the beginning. And and the Time's Up movement. Are we making progress, do you think, to create a world that's safe for all women?
You know, I do think that we are making progress to make a world that is safe for all women, men, children, non-binary people. I do believe that we have made progress because we are finally openly talking about something that was supposed to be kept secret. You know, I believe that when we can finally bring things out into the open, that is when we have the opportunity to actually make great change. And so thanks to the leadership and the vision of Tarana Burke, there was this breakthrough that happened in 2018 that allowed the world to finally understand that we have to talk about these problems because that's the only way to get to the solutions. I think that we are also now figuring out how do we speak openly about them and then drive towards the solutions, right? We're not trying to create a situation in which everyone gets kicked off of the island if they engage in violent behavior. We have to come up with remedial programs, and the preventative measures have to be put in place. And I think that we're finally moving in the right direction. Funding is finally coming. I don't think that most people recognize the fact that Tarana's work had been unfunded prior to the breakthrough. Our work, you know, with Alianza and the work that we were doing on anti-violence had been unfunded. Many of the organizations doing work on the ground had not received funding. But now, because of the breakthrough, there are foundations who are coming forward to try to resource the work. And that's really important because if we don't have the resources, then we can't do the work that we need to do. So I think there have been some positive developments. We certainly have a long way to go, but I think we're walking in the right direction.
Thank you. I agree with you. And we've talked about the terrible situation that exists for Indigenous women on their tribal lands with the man camps. They're very rural communities. And then, you know, literally right now, for example, in northern Minnesota, the Enbridge Line 3 is being constructed. We have to try to stop that. So already 2,000 or more men have come from Utah, from Texas and other places into this very rural place at the headwaters of the Mississippi. Not wearing masks, exposing the people to COVID. And, you know, there's a great fear that what has happened in that area already with hundreds of Indigenous women who are either found dead or have been raped or simply disappeared. And of course, the numbers are unreported, so we don't really know how many. But do you feel, Allie, that it's getting better?
I don't, honestly. And the only way that it can get better is by shutting down these pipelines and the construction, you know, in a just way, you know, just transition. But yeah, I mean, as long as it continues, Native women will always be in harm's way.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We somehow have to protect them better and help our men understand that being a man doesn't mean you attack women. You know, that they find their masculinity in another way. I want to move on to the subject of diversity and representation. Both of you are activists for the right to vote and for more representation in the government. And we now have one of the most diverse cabinets and administrations in place. Allie, you ran some innovative campaigns to raise awareness about the importance of voting. Tell us about them.
I led something called Ride to the Polls. We rode on horseback to go vote. And yeah, it was something that I did with my father. It was my father's idea. And I was raised in not only traditionally and ceremonially, but in cowboy culture, which is often pretty prevalent in Indigenous communities. I don't think a lot of people know that. A lot of our people are like into rodeo culture. And so I was raised around cattle and, you know, horses and horseback riding. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a professional barrel racer. So I had, my horse, and it's become a bonding activity for my father and for me. And he had mentioned that he wanted to do a horseback ride for sort of campaigning for Biden. And so I kind of thought about it, and I was like, that's a cool idea. When I started focusing on getting out the vote, and especially geared towards young voters, because on the ground I was hearing that young voters didn't want to cast their ballots because they're so sickened and frustrated with the system. And a lot of the feedback that we were getting was, well, why do we continue to participate in this colonial system? And I said, I understand that and I believe it, but this is the most important election in our lifetime, and we just can't sit this one out. And so how do we engage young Native people? Young Native people have great respect for the youth and the future generations, but as well as our elders and our ancestors. So that's how I, framed this campaign is, we're doing this in honor of our ancestors who fought for our right to vote. And we're thinking about them as we're riding. Riding to the polls on horseback is cultural, it's traditional, connecting with the horse spirit by riding the horse. And so we're riding about 2 hours to the polling place. And in that time, we're surrounded by our own homelands and what we're fighting for. And we have all of that time to think exactly, about the future and investing in the future. And it was a very powerful way to arrive to the polls. And it excited a lot of my community. And, it worked.
That's very beautiful. And the turnout among Indigenous peoples was higher than it's ever been. So thank you for that. Mónica, what impact does diversity have on policy? Why is it so important?
Diversity is so important for policy because if people are making legislation come from the communities that they are representing, the legislation is going to be more likely to actually serve the people that it's intended to serve. I live in rural America, and I often get frustrated because I feel as though people are legislating all of the time for rural America, and they've never been to rural America. And so we need rural America to be represented, but we also need very specific communities, marginalized communities, to be in Congress. And, also involved in local politics and at the state level too, because in all of those places, there are decisions that are being made that impact us. And the reality is that people from our communities have always been leading in our communities. We just have not always had the formal titles or positions that would enable us to make the kinds of decisions that are being made at the city, state, and federal level. And we need to change that. And so I'm really thrilled to see all of the new programs that are inviting new community members to learn about running for office, seeking political appointments, and actually running people and helping people to win these elected positions, because that's how I think we're going to eventually see justice and not just equality. People always say, we're fighting for equality, but we're not just fighting for equality, because sometimes the laws are unjust. So we need to make sure that there are just laws that are being passed that serve all people, and we will get there by having diverse political representation.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. What gives you hope, Mónica?
Oh my gosh, all of the people, everyday people who are speaking out about what they care about, who are trying to find ways to get engaged. Allie inspires me and gives me hope. All the different campaigns we've seen around the country that are, 2 and 3 people who are coming together and making a decision to make a difference in any way that they can. That gives me hope.
What gives you hope, Allie?
The youth, and they're smarter than ever. They're smarter than my generation, and just so innovative. And I think that they're truly gonna save us. And I think I've always been an advocate for youth and Native youth especially.
And what inspires you?
my family and my upbringing in my culture, my cultural foundation, and everything that what my culture has taught me is to walk in huozhong, walk in beauty. And when you're surrounded by beauty, and when and beauty means balance and harmony. And so when you're living your life in balance, that's, I think that's the key. And when you're so in sync with yourself and your surroundings, that's where I draw from, because then I'm constantly thinking like, what's causing an offset in the balance? This pandemic is it makes it clear to me that there's an offset in the balance. And why is that? It's because of the way that we're treating Mother Earth. And in order to correct that, in order to heal, we have to be conscious of what's happening. And so that's what inspires me and my grandparents, and the prayers and the ceremonies that have made me the woman I am today.
Thank you. What inspires you, Mónica?
I echo the sentiments around family and culture, but one of the things that I'm deeply inspired by right now is the fact that I believe that many of us from different communities, marginalized communities in particular, we understand that we are the answer, that we have the answers, and we're embracing our power in a way that I don't know we've ever done before. And I think that was very evident in this past election and the way that people showed up. And I'm really excited to see what's to come, because people didn't stop organizing after the election. They've continued to organize, and it makes me really eager to continue doing the work with all the new friends that we've made along the way.
I couldn't agree with you more. Well, I'll tell you that both of you inspire me, put starch in my spine, and I'm very grateful I've had the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Likewise.